He had ordered the deaths of 17 men. But the moment she took his hand across that table, the chef standing just feet away dropped his knife and whispered, "Something is about to change forever." The kitchen went silent. Not the silence of emptiness. The silence of something arriving. Nobody in that villa had ever seen Enzo drop anything. Not in 22 years. His hands were the most controlled thing in that house, steadier than the guards, more disciplined than the boss himself. So when the knife hit the stone floor and rang out like a bell, the two young kitchen assistants froze and looked at each other. Enzo didn't pick it up immediately. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the dining room doorway, watching something the rest of the house hadn't noticed yet. He would later say he couldn't explain it, only that the air had changed. And in a house built on fear, he had just felt something that fear has no room for. He had felt the first tremor of hope. Marco Vitelli had not eaten a home-cooked meal in 11 years. Not since his mother died. Not since the funeral, when he stood at her graveside in a black suit, surrounded by men who feared him and realized with absolute clarity that there was no one left on earth who loved him without condition. That was the day he made a silent decision. Warmth was a liability. Closeness was an open window in a house full of enemies. He shut every window. By 41, Marco ran the most feared criminal organization in southern Italy. Ports, construction, politicians, his reach was invisible and total. Men spoke his name carefully, the way you speak near something that can detonate. His villa sat on a cliff above the Amalfi coast, beautiful and impenetrable, a perfect metaphor for the man inside it. He had everything, absolutely everything. And at night, in the quiet after the meetings and the calls and the decisions, he would sit alone in his father's old chair and stare at the sea, and feel the particular heaviness of a man who has confused control with contentment for so long he can no longer tell the difference. He told no one this. He barely admitted it to himself. But Enzo knew. Enzo always knew. Because for 22 years, he had been feeding this man, and a chef who pays attention learns things about hunger that go far beyond the stomach. Elena Russo was not the kind of woman who entered a room and commanded it. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and steadied it. 34 years old. A hospice nurse for 9 years. She had sat at the bedsides of over 200 dying people, holding hands, absorbing last words, bearing witness to the exits of strangers. Her colleagues sometimes asked how she carried it. She always said the same thing. "I don't carry it. I just stay present long enough for them not to feel alone." She had come to the villa not by choice, but because of her brother Luca. Luca was 26, reckless, and deeply in over his head. A debt to Marco's organization. Money borrowed, promises broken, consequences mounting. The arrangement offered was cold and transactional. Elena would serve as live-in caregiver for Marco's father, Donato, who was 81 and declining. 30 days.
No salary.
The debt erased. She accepted without hesitation. Not out of weakness. Out of the same quiet ferocity that had carried her through 9 years of watching people die, the absolute refusal to let someone she loved face the darkness alone. She arrived on a Tuesday evening with one bag and no illusions. Marco met her at the entrance, for exactly 45 seconds. He told her the rules, his father's room, the garden, the kitchen. Nowhere else. No conversations beyond what the care required.
No opinions. No complications.
She looked at him steadily and said, "Understood." He walked away first. And something about the way she watched him go, calm, unbothered, completely unintimidated, made Enzo, watching from the kitchen corridor, quietly set down his spoon and think, this one is different. By the third day, Enzo had already decided to change the menu. He couldn't explain the logic to anyone else. It was instinct, the same instinct that told him when a guest needed heat and when they needed something light, when a room called for celebration and when it called for comfort. He had spent 2 decades reading invisible signals, and everything in the villa was telling him the same thing. Someone in this house was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. He made his mother's ribollita, a humble Tuscan soup, day-old bread, white beans, dark greens, slow-cooked until thick and deeply fragrant. The kind of food that doesn't try to impress you. It just holds you. He hadn't made it in years. He wasn't sure why he made it now. He just knew he had to. He placed it on the long dining table without announcement and said nothing. When Marco sat down that evening and the bowl was set before him, he stopped, completely still, spoon in hand, not moving. The two guards near the door exchanged a glance. This was not the usual meal. This was not what was ordered. Marco said nothing. He just stared at the bowl. Then Elena walked in from the corridor, finished with Donato for the evening, intending only to pass through. She saw Marco at the table alone, frozen over his food, and she did not do what anyone else in that house would have done. She did not retreat. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down.
No imbitasten. No epalegi. No explanasten.
Marco looked up. The expression on his face was almost impossible to read. Not anger, not surprise, but something underneath both of those. Something older. The silence between them lasted nearly a full minute. Then Elena reached across the table and rested her hand over his. Not a gesture of romance. Not pity. The gesture of a woman who had spent 9 years sitting beside people who were frightened and pretending not to be. The gesture that said, I see you. You don't have to perform right now. In the kitchen doorway, Enzo watched, and he picked up his knife and then set it back down, because what was happening at that table was too important to look away from. Word travels fast in a closed house. By the 5th day, Marco's lieutenant, a sharp, humorless man named Caruso, had noticed the change in atmosphere. He couldn't name it precisely, but he felt it the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. Something had shifted in the villa's carefully maintained tension. He found Enzo alone in the kitchen at 6 in the morning and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. The nurse, he said flatly. She's softening him. Enzo continued chopping without looking up. I cook food, Caruso. I don't monitor personalities. He let her sit at his table. He hasn't dismissed her. She's been in the main corridor twice in areas she has no business being in, and no one has been told to correct it. Caruso's voice dropped. That's not protocol. That's distraction. And distraction in this house gets people killed. Enzo set down his knife, turned, looked at Caruso for a long moment, then turned back to his cutting board and said, very quietly, or it gets them saved. Caruso left without responding. That evening, Enzo prepared the most elaborate meal the villa had seen in months. Not to celebrate, not on anyone's orders, but because he understood something with complete clarity. A man who has begun to feel again is not a weakened man. He is a man standing at a crossroads. And the food set before him at that crossroads either reminds him of everything worth protecting, or it means nothing at all. Enzo is not about to let it mean nothing. On the 19th day, the envelope arrived. Marco read it alone in his office with the door closed, and by the time he set it down, the decision in his mind was already formed. The way decisions form in men who have made them so many times that the mechanism has become automatic. Clean. Weightless. Final. Luca Russo had been caught skimming money from a collection route. Small amounts. Probably thought it was invisible. It wasn't. In Marco's world, the response to this was not a conversation. Every man in the villa, from the guards to Enzo himself, knew what the envelope meant when it arrived. Marco sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He was not conflicted. He told himself he was not conflicted. Then Elena knocked. She didn't know about the envelope. She had come only to say goodnight. She made a habit of it now, a quiet pause at his office door, never entering unless invited, never overstaying. It had become one of the only unscheduled moments in his day, and he had stopped pretending he didn't look forward to it. She stepped inside, took one look at his face, and she sat down. Whatever you're about to do, she said quietly, I want you to sit with it for one more minute. The silence that followed was enormous. The kind that has weight. The kind that asks something of both people inside it. Then Marco Vitelli, who had not told anyone the truth about anything in 11 years, opened his mouth and told her everything. Not the facts, not the logistics, the truth underneath the facts. That he was exhausted. That he had constructed a life of total dominance and found it completely hollow. That the only moment He had felt genuinely human in a decade was sitting at a table eating soup he hadn't ordered, next to a woman who touched his hand like he wasn't a threat. He said it plainly, without performance. The way a man speaks when he has simply run out of the energy to pretend. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't offer comfort immediately. She sat with it. The way she sat with the hard truths of the people in her care and let the weight of his words fill the room without rushing to make it lighter. Then she looked at him and said, "That man you just described? He's still in there. He's who I've been talking to." Marco looked at the envelope on his desk. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Luca Russo was released before midnight. The fallout was immediate. Two of Marco's senior lieutenants requested meetings within 24 hours. Both conversations were short and cold. Both men read the decision about Luca as something they had never seen from Marco before: hesitation. Sentiment. The first fracture in a decade of absolute resolve. One transferred his loyalties quietly. One made a less quiet exit that required Marco to respond with force. There were costs. Real ones. The kind measured in power and position and the currency of fear that organizations like Marco's run entirely on. Marco absorbed it all without explanation. Because the only person who deserved the explanation already understood, and she hadn't asked for it. Enzo watched from the edges of all of it. He saw the lieutenants leave. He saw the tightening of the guards' postures, the whispered conversations in corridors, the recalibration of a household trying to read a man who was suddenly harder to predict. He cooked through all of it, quietly, deliberately, anchoring the house in the one language that required no loyalty and carried no agenda. On the 25th day, Donato, Marco's father, took Elena's hand during his evening care and said to her in a thin but clear voice, he used to laugh. When his mother was alive, this house used to laugh. He paused. Then, I can almost hear it again. Elena said nothing. She just held the old man's hand and let the words settle. That night, she stood on the garden terrace alone, looking out at the sea. Marco appeared beside her without announcement. The way he moved through his own house, soundless and certain. They stood together for a long time without speaking. He said eventually, "You're leaving in 5 days." "Yes," she said. "And you'll go back to your work. Your patients." "Yes." A long pause. "Do you ever get tired of holding people through the hardest parts?" She thought about it honestly before she answered.
No.
Because the hard parts are where people are most real. And real is the only thing worth being present for. Marco said nothing, but he stayed standing beside her until the sea wind picked up and the lights on the water blurred. On the 30th day, Elena packed her bag. One bag. Same as the day she arrived. She moved through her room with the efficient, unsentimentalized calm of a woman who had learned not to grip too hard at things, because her entire life had taught her that presence, not permanence, was the real gift. She said goodbye to Donato first. He held her hand for a long time and didn't try to speak. She pressed her forehead gently to his and whispered something private, then walked out of his room and quietly closed the door. She found Marco in the main hallway. He stood 10 feet back from the front entrance, hands in his pockets, the particular posture of a man who has spent his whole life engineering distance and now, for perhaps the first time, felt the distance as a loss rather than a shield. He did not ask her to stay. It was not in him to ask. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was the honest truth of where he still was, the still forming edge of a man mid-transformation. But he looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of someone who is no longer pretending, and that, Elena understood, was enormous. For him, that was enormous. She crossed the 10 feet between them. She said something quietly. Only for him. Marco stood completely still. Something moved through his face, not a smile exactly, but the architecture of one. The suggestion of a man remembering what his face was capable of. He nodded once. She picked up her bag. She walked out into the bright Amalfi morning. Enzo stood at the end of the hallway, holding a dish towel, watching Marco watch the door close. He waited. Then, because 22 years had taught him exactly when a man needed to be fed and when he needed to be left alone, he turned quietly and walked back to his kitchen. He began preparing breakfast.
4-2.
She came back the next morning.
No announcement.
No explanation offered and none required. She appeared at the villa entrance at 8:15 with her bag over her shoulder and a simplicity in her expression that asked nothing dramatic of the moment. The guard at the gate looked at her, looked toward the house, then stepped aside. Marco was in the kitchen, which was, in itself, something none of the staff had seen in years. He was standing at the counter with a coffee cup, talking to Enzo about nothing in particular, and there was something loosened in his posture, something approximate to ordinary, that made the kitchen feel briefly like a place where ordinary things happened. When she walked in, he looked up. He said nothing. But the stillness in him was different from before. Not the stillness of a man sealing himself off, but the stillness of a man allowing himself to be seen. Enzo set a second cup on the counter without being asked. And outside, above the Amalfi coast, the morning light did what it does. It fell across everything without distinction. The beautiful and the broken, the powerful and the frightened, the man who had forgotten how to be reached, and the woman who had quietly, stubbornly, refused to stop reaching. Here is what Enzo understood that nobody else in that villa did. He understood it not because he was wiser than the guards or more perceptive than the lieutenants, but because he spent 22 years paying attention to hunger. Real hunger. The kind that has nothing to do with what's on the table. He had watched Marco eat for over 2 decades. He had seen the way a powerful man consumes food when he is only consuming it, efficiently, joylessly, fuel for the machine. And he had seen on that third evening the exact moment the Ribolita arrived and Marco stopped. Just stopped. Because the smell had reached something that was still alive underneath all that armor. Something that remembered his mother's kitchen, warmth without condition, a time before the weight of everything. Enzo knew then that it wasn't about the soup. It was about the fact that something in Marco still wanted, still responded, was not, despite everything, entirely closed. And Elena, without knowing any of this, without strategy, without agenda, had simply walked into that response and stayed. She had done what she always did. She had been completely present with someone who was frightened and pretending not to be. In 22 years of cooking for men who moved the world, Enzo had never seen anything more powerful than that. This is the thing the story is really telling you. It is not about a mafia boss transformed by love, neat and cinematic as that sounds. It is about what happens when one person absolutely refuses to treat you as what you've become and insists quietly without drama on addressing what you still are underneath it. Elena didn't rescue Marco. She just kept showing up without armor in a house full of it. And slowly, inevitably, the contrast became impossible to ignore. You cannot be around genuine presence for very long without feeling the weight of your own performance. And sometimes the most radical thing one human being can do for another is simply stay in the room, without fear, without agenda, without looking away. Enzo picked up his knife that first evening and then set it down because he sensed the beginning of something that deserved a witness. He was right. If this story stayed with you, press the like button and subscribe because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories that don't just entertain you. They remind you of something true. And I want to ask you something in the comments. Has there ever been a person in your life who refused to see you as what you become and only saw what you still could be?
Tell me about them.
Because those people deserve to be named.